Okay, we're going to do 3 examples of how to solve a quadratic equation by factoring. So remember, there are 4 different methods we can solve a quadratic equation. One is by graphing, and then you look and see where it crosses the x-axis. The second one is when there is no b, you can just solve for x. And then the third one is solving by factoring, and then we'll talk about the fourth one, quadratic formula, later. When you solve by factoring, reminder, it has to equal 0 before you can start factoring. So if it doesn't equal 0, make sure you move things around so that it does. And then now we need to factor this. When there is a leading coefficient, so a coefficient in front of your x squared term, you first can check for a GCF. There is not a greatest common factor between 2, 9, and 5. So there is no GCF. So then to get rid of that leading coefficient, remember we slide it to the back, and when we slide it to the back, we multiply. So it becomes x squared minus 9x minus 10 equals 0. And when there is no leading coefficient, then if we're going to factor it, we can go ahead and factor it into the 2 sets of parentheses. So we're going to set up our 2 parentheses. X times x gives us x squared, so that's why we can go ahead and set those up. Then a minus sign in the back. Remember, you always check the back sign first. That means we need one positive and one negative, because a positive times a negative is what's going to give us that negative 10. So now you need to find 2 numbers that multiply to give us negative 10 and add to give us negative 9. So numbers that multiply to 10, we've got 5 and 2, but a positive 5 and a negative 2 isn't going to give us negative 9. We also have 10 and 1. So if I do 10 and negative 1, that would give us a positive 9 if we added them together. So that means we need a positive 1 and a negative 10. If I'm going too fast with the factoring, then feel free to look back on some of the old factoring videos just to kind of refresh your memory on how to do some of this. Now, because we slid the 2 in the back and we multiplied by that 2, now we need to undo that step. So to undo that multiplication by 2, now we're going to divide both of our factors by 2. So we get x plus 1/2, or we would call this 2x plus 1. And 10 divided by 2 is just 5, so x minus 5. Now here was that extra step. If we were just factoring, we would be done right here. And our 2 factors would be 2x plus 1 and x minus 5. But because it has an equal 0 right there, now we need to do our next step, which is to set both of these factors equal to 0 to solve for x. So we have 2x plus 1 equals 0 and x minus 5 equals 0. So this one's easy. You just add 5 to both sides. So x equals positive 5, that's one solution. That means if you plug in 5 for x up here, you'll get 0. And then for our other solution, we've got 2 steps. If we're going to solve for x or get x by itself, we need to subtract 1 first. So 2x equals negative 1. Then we divide both sides by 2. So x equals negative 1/2. So we have 2 solutions. This means that this quadratic equation, if we were to graph it, would cross the x-intercept, or the x-axis, at negative 1/2, and it would cross at positive 5. And if we backed up back here, notice that these are just the opposites of these. So this says plus 1/2, so we get negative 1/2. 10 divided by 2 is 5, so this says minus 5. And so we get positive 5, and it'll always be the opposite of the 2 factors that you get. Okay, example number 2. So what's different about this example is our quadratic equation doesn't equal 0. We know we need it to equal to 0 before we can either solve by factoring or solve by using the quadratic formula. And also we know it's a quadratic because our biggest degree, we have an exponent of 2 right there. So in order to make it equal to 0, right now it equals 8x, we need to move that 8x over to the other side of the equal sign. So since this is a positive 8x, we're going to subtract 8x. So it's going to say x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0, because now nothing is left on the right side of the equal sign, which is what we wanted. And now we've got a nice, easy quadratic formula, or quadratic equation that we can factor. The reason why I put the minus 8x in the middle instead of just adding it onto the outside is, in order to factor or to use the quadratic formula, which we'll do later, you need them in standard form, which means you start with the biggest exponent and it goes down from there. So here, there is no leading coefficient in front of our x squared term, so we can go ahead and set up our two parentheses. X times x is x squared. Plus sign in the back means they're the same sign. They're both negative. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to 15 and add to get us negative 8. So some numbers that multiply to 15, we've got 3 and 5. So negative 3 and negative 5, those add to negative 8. So that's it. We did not slide anything to the back and multiply, so we don't need to divide. So this is not our final answer. Our final answers are not negative 3 and negative 5. We still have to set them both equal to 0. So now that we set them both equal to 0, we add 3. So our answers are positive 3 and positive 5 when we add that 5 over to the other side. So two answers, x equals 3, x equals 5. That means your parabola is going to cross at positive 3 and positive 5 on the x-axis. One more. Once again, we have a quadratic because the degree is 2. And again, it doesn't equal 0 and we need it to. Now, most of you would look at this and you would say if we want it to equal 0, the easiest thing to do is to subtract the 6x squared over to that side because then you only have to move one term over. But we really like that leading coefficient, which would be this one in this case. The one with the highest degree, we like that one to be positive, and 6x squared is positive, and we want to keep it that way. So we're actually going to move the negative 7x over to the other side of the equal sign by adding 7x, and we're going to move the negative 2 to the other side of the equal sign by adding 2. So we get 6x squared. When you add 7x to both sides, you get plus 7x. When we add 2 to both sides, we get plus 2. So basically, if ever it moves from one side of the equal sign to the other, you just change the sign. If it's positive on one side of the equal sign, it's negative on the other. If it's negative on one side of the equal sign, it's positive on the other. Easy peasy stuff. And now it equals 0 because we moved them both over, and now there's nothing left on that right side. All right, now we need to factor. So first step, check for a GCF. There isn't one. So to get rid of that 6, we slide to the back. So now we have x squared plus 7x plus 12. I'm going to go quickly through the factoring part. There's no leading coefficient, so we can set up x and x. Plus means same. They're both positive. Two numbers that multiply to 12 and add to 7. Those are 3 and 4. All right, now here's the tricky part to remember. Because we multiplied by 6, now we have to go back through and divide by 6. And 3/6, that can be reduced. 3 over 6 reduces to 1 over 2, 1/2. And if one can be reduced, so can the other one. So 4 over 6, that can be reduced. If you divide them both by 2, you get 2/3. So you can stop right here and just know that once you have your two factors, the answers are the opposite. So your answers here are x equals negative 1/2 and x equals negative 2/3. But if you like kind of the process of what we're doing here, next we would bottoms up. So 2x plus 1 and 3x plus 2. Once you have your two factors, now we need to set them both equal to 0 and solve. So 2x plus 1 equals 0, and 3x plus 2 equals 0. So when you solve this one, you subtract 1 from both sides. So 2x equals negative 1. So divide by 2, x equals negative 1/2. There's answer number 1. Answer number 2, subtract 2 from both sides. So 3x equals negative 2, divide by 3. So x equals negative 2/3. There's answer number 2. So the parabola would cross at negative 1/2 and negative 2/3. So it's a real skinny parabola right there.